The reputed heads of all 5 crime families in our town were hauled into court on one indictment.
Great day for law enforcement, but this is a bad day, probably the worst, for the mafia. This case charges more mafia bosses in one indictment than any ever before.
Big Paul Castellano. According to lawmen, he's boss of the 800 gangsters who are said to make up the Gambino crime family. Castellano and the 4 other men fingered by the feds as godfathers of New York's 5 crime families, all indicted today. Castellano left the federal courthouse in Lower Manhattan tonight after posting $2 million bail money.
I want to speak about an unusual conversation that took place in 1985 between Paul Castellano and the FBI agents who arrested him. The following comes from the book Boss of Bosses. On February 25, 1985, FBI agents pulled into a circular driveway of a Staten Island house dubbed the White House, belonging to Gambino boss Paul Castellano. His arrest came as a result of a RICO indictment that charged the bosses of all 5 families in what would become known the commission case. After allowing Castellano to change into a suit, he was taken into custody, and he thanked the agents for not handcuffing him in front of his family. Obviously, preferential treatment for a boss. Anyone else would have had handcuffs slapped on them regardless who was watching. During the car ride into Manhattan, a news report came over the radio. This just in. At this moment, agents of the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the New York State Organized Crime Task Force are arresting the reputed leaders of all New York's 5 families. According to U.S. Attorney Rudolph Giuliani, the arrests are part of the most far-fetching mob investigations ever, an investigation aimed at convicting the entire mafia leadership, the so-called commission, under federal racketeering statutes. Tonight's arrest caps a 4-year law enforcement effort, which, according to one highly placed source, included the 1983 bugging of the Staten Island home of Paul Castellano, alleged boss of the Gambino family and de facto head of the commission. At that moment in time, Castellano, realizing they'd been bugging his house for 2 years, knew he was finished. And this showed by his train of mind and what he asked the agents. How bad does it look for me? I'm not sure what answer he expected to hear, but one of the agents told him, very bad, sir. He would spend that night at the MCC in Manhattan. The next morning, Agents Joseph O'Brien and Andres Currens, who arrested Castellano the day before, gave him the option to remain in lockup or go with them. He agreed to go with the agents, but asked if they would use anything he said against him. Let me just say, Castellano, being a boss, should have known very well anything he told the agents would be used against him. And he was told this. They also gave him the option to consult with his lawyer. But he refused, saying, "My lawyer I can talk to any time for a fee. How often do I get to smooze with the FBI?" They escorted him to an office located inside the courthouse. I've personally seen these offices. They're antiquated and dingy. He was permitted to smoke a cigar and then began to make small talk with the agents. He told them, growing up, he had 2 choices. Do things one way, you have a certain set of circumstances. And another way, you had a different set of circumstances. Basically, like most of us, he had the option of being legit or living as a criminal. He then spoke of family obligations and traditions. And as if the agents didn't know, he mentioned his close ties that his family had to the Gambinos. He then said, there are certain promises you make that are more sacred than anything that happens in a court of law. I don't care how many Bibles you put your hand on. And what he's speaking about is the oath that you take during an induction. Some of the promises, it's true, you make too young, before you really have an understanding of what they mean. In other words, at the time of an induction, you don't fully comprehend what it is that you're getting yourself into. He continued, but once you made those first promises, other promises are called for, meaning the mob wants more and more from you or expects more from you. And the thing is, you can't deny the new ones without betraying the old ones. And what he means is, after taking an oath, you're obligated to the family in anything that's asked of you. The promises get bigger. And he uses the word promises, but he means expectations. There are more people to be hurt and disappointed if you don't live up to them. Then at some point, you're called upon to make a promise to a dying man. He obviously was speaking about Carlo Gambino, which Agent Currens blurts out. But Castellano tells him, certain names we don't use lightly. I would agree, but the person whose name he was protecting wouldn't approve of or ever had the conversation he was having with these 2 agents. I found this entire conversation intriguing, coming from a boss. I'm not sure whether he just wanted to get out of the cell and bullshit, or as some people suggested, he was testing the waters to cooperate. Who really knows? What's even more unbelievable is he suggested that the agents and him go for corned beef sandwiches, and they wind up taking him out for lunch at the 2nd Avenue Deli. Later that afternoon, he went before a judge and was released on $4 million bail. And by December of that year, he would be killed. It would have been interesting to see how it all played out had he been alive to either go to trial or possibly cooperate.